Welcome to the Unscripted podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Nicastro. Today, we're going to be taking a look at 10 success factors for complex global service operations. To share that insight with us, I'm excited to welcome to the podcast Mark Florio, who is the Senior Director of Global Robotics Service and Support at the Robotic Surgical Technologies Division of Medtronic. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Sarah, and I appreciate you having me on. I look forward
Yeah,
to this.
happy to have you. So before we get into our discussion, can you just share a little bit more about yourself, your role, and tell everyone a little bit about the robotics business at Medtronic?
Sure. Again, Mark Florio. I've been with Medtronic, well, first Covidian through Medtronic since 2010. I started on the robotics project, as it was called back then, in 2014, and I was one of the original employees to see the robot grow up and launch, and I have a chance to support it. I've been in the medical device industry for about 35 years. I started my career in the service, in the military service, not service and repair, and pretty much went into medical devices right after that. And I've enjoyed a great career here. Within a little bit about Medtronic and the organization I work within. So we're Robotic Surgical Technologies, RST, yet another acronym. And my team, like a lot of large companies, corporations in this hand, we have a regional and an operating unit structure. Think globally and regionally in very
Hmm.
simple terms. It's very common in large groups where the regional partners, our regional service delivery partners, are providing the actual service delivery in most regions, and we're the kind of the global overlay that provides strategy, direction, KPIs. We also do a lot of work around service training, technical writing. I have a robotic depot that handles product complaint analysis, sometimes called failure analysis, but basically we receive the parts, we test it, we verify what the complaint was in the field, and then those parts are put through to either refurbishment or other sources, and that's a very complex process, but very
Hmm.
important. We also do, well, I mentioned field service training, so my team trains all the regional service providers, the field service engineers. We write the curriculum, we train it, and then we export the training regionally. And then I also have a very small group called customer engagement, and that's largely program management around the service programs that we provide, measuring KPIs and customer satisfaction, and then providing that data back up through my team and then leadership and then back out to the regions so that we have fast, rapid understanding of anything from service trends to usage trends to parts flow, et cetera. So
Hmm.
that's my organization. We're part of the operating unit, global unit. We work very closely with our regional partners and have done so from day one.
Okay, great. So I'm curious, Mark, for those within our audience who are not in the medical space, can you just talk a little bit more about the robotics? Like, you mentioned you've had the opportunity to kind of support that from early days to today. Can you just talk a little bit about that evolution and, where Medtronic is today with the robotic products itself?
Sure. So basically, and I'll start from yeah, we're in the market. We've been in the market for over 3 years on a global basis. So we have actual hands-on experience supporting the Yugo robotic platform. So that, I'm kind of speaking from experience versus futures. I think it comes down to, with larger corporations, there's often already a service structure out there. There's field service engineers managing multiple products, there's centers of excellence, there are depots. There's a service delivery, and all the big companies have this, but it's not
Hmm.
just unique to Medtronic. But what we have to do and is understand, even large capital products are not all the same. We think in segments. There's small capital commodity products, small capital new products. There's large capital commodity products, and then there's large capital new. and a new complex robot is uniquely different than, say, an older ventilator.
Mm-hmm.
And a customer may have 20 ventilators in the hospital. If one needs a repair or planned maintenance down for a few days, it's not a big deal. But if a customer has one robot and surgery is scheduled on a continuous basis, then the service delivery has to be customized, and it has to be kind of focused very carefully around the customer requirements. So not all large capital is treated equally, nor should it be. And so the opportunity that Medtronic gave us was to kind of customize the approach of supporting Hugo from the customer on back. And instead of just building a plan that satisfies an operations goal, we really started from the customer viewpoint. What do they need? What do they require in every region, not just US centric or Europe centric, but what does a customer in, I don't know, say India need versus Brazil versus the US? They can be different, and making sure that you don't deliver a homogeneous service plan is important. You have to do some customization. You have to realize that certain countries have different requirements. Like in India, they don't use refurbished parts. So you have to build your plan around that sort of support element. So that's just, again, a very high level. It's important to use the service organizations, the regional organizations, because they're already delivering very good service. Really, our goal is to customize that a little bit and to nudge different strategies and kind of find the right approach so that a customer sees flawless service no matter what the product, whether it's an older piece of capital or a brand new, highly technical robot that is very complex.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, whether it's med device or other industries, to your point, there are a lot of these really, really large, really complex global service operations. And, I've talked to different folks that, companies can structure that approach differently depending on what they're doing. But we talked about some success factors that you've found in your experience that you feel have been instrumental in your success. And I think it's always interesting for others, even if it is a different industry, to hear what those are and take that into consideration. So let's dive into those. So the first one is, you mentioned this centering around customers, okay? And as part of that, also learning how to sell the value of service. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that ironically, and in a good way, that was actually the first assignment when I was given the service strategy. I was a N of 1 at the time. And so the ask was basically just go out in the field and learn from the best. Don't limit yourself to just what Medtronic can do, but study the competition, study the best in class, talk to people. And actually, that was a lot of fun, going out in the field and observing surgical cases, talking to experienced field service delivery companies, and really going to professional society meetings and basically uncovering, the base requirements. What would be a successful delivery plan in the eyes of the hospital C-suite, the biomedical engineers, the surgeons, and the staff who are operating every day. And they have slightly different, unique needs, and it's important not to just focus on one over the other. So you have to deliver service to the ecosystem that the robot is working in, and it may be different, and understanding the regional nuances are really important. So that was a lesson we learned from day one, and we stuck to it. And we often, Medtronic has a great culture, very patient-centric culture, and obviously we focus on the patient because the robot has to work and be safe and effective and all the above for the patient outcomes to be good. And we take that very seriously from the top on down. So all of our decisions, all of the processes we do are all aligned towards delivering that very simple Medtronic cultural approach of, putting the patient first. And in that patient, in many regards, is represented by the surgeon, by the hospital. So when they say, for example, that we're operating, 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, that implies that they need a very high uptime delivery, and that also informs our strategy. How do we deploy the necessary spare parts so that we don't create downtime? How do we train the right level of expertise so that a service engineer can go into the operating room and work with the customer and even visualize what's going on. Because sometimes a problem is not always a design issue or a system issue. Sometimes it's user errors, and understanding how the customer is using the robot helps us kind of provide that feedback to the trainers and to the customer and to ensure that the product continues to operate safely. But it starts with the customer, and there's uptime, mean time to repair. Those are really important internal metrics that if you get them right, the customer should be pretty well satisfied, and that's kind of important. It sounds simple, but it really isn't. You really have to listen, and just because you listened, say 5 years ago, doesn't mean you're good. You have to continuously go out because the world changes.
Yeah.
The market changes, requirements change, budgets always get smaller, costs always, there's a lot of pressure to reduce costs continuously, no matter where you are in the product life cycle. So paying attention to the customer is really important.
Yeah. There's a lot of good points in there. I like the point you made about, understanding what it would take, not just to be the best at what Medtronic can deliver, but what is the best of what everyone's doing, and having that context. I like your point about, looking at that from the perspective of all of the different stakeholders, not just focusing on one and missing an opportunity elsewhere. And, I love the point about the fact that it's a moving target. You can't go through this exercise once and then not revisit it for years on end, right? You have to maintain that communication and keep that understanding current. So really good points. So the second point here is set a single understanding of what service will deliver and agree clear and collaborative requirements with clear roles and responsibilities. Sounds really easy, but
it's very important because and I'm sure the listeners who are all part of large corporations are all probably nodding their head at the same time. Sometimes, big corporations often move slower than smaller, startup corporations. So, and not only that, but there's different constituencies within an organization that have requirements, and it's not just the sales teams, the commercial teams, the marketing teams, but it includes finance. They have goals and they want to ensure that profitability and cost expenses are understood. So working with them, getting a 5 to 10 year look at what the pro forma, the strat plan should be, and making sure they're fully aligned, because at some point, having a good relationship and setting the requirements early means that if we do need resources, those folks are part of the process. They've been engaged and they fully understand when we need a headcount, for example, or a piece of machinery, or we need a system change to facilitate requirements. So there's certainly internal requirements. And then you get into the global regional roles. Again, everyone's charging towards the same objective, but sometimes it can be very easy to create redundancies. So it's important to start negotiating roles and responsibilities, budgets, collaboration calls, making sure there's clear understanding of what the leadership wants, and leadership has a goal and customers have a requirement, and pulling them together and meeting those two are often what we're trying to do there. So, and it's not just KPIs, but it's when will service deliver the products? What's the turnaround time on parts? What's the downtime? And then you get into how do we communicate escalations and issues such that all of our customers are fully informed. And when I say all the customers, I'm making that intentional because we're going to talk a little bit about internal customers in the future. They're a really important part of this ecosystem. So anyway, that's kind of it. And I think that's very clear. Big organizations, if you have to make changes, you have to start early, because nobody's going to make a massive SAP change overnight, for example, because it affects different elements of the business. And so being a good partner to the entire business and understanding what do we need today that will deliver the best service to our customer versus something we could possibly put off for the future that may not be critical for today. So it's important, constantly changes, but you have to understand, have a roadmap and a goal for what are we trying to achieve before you start building the plan.
Yeah, makes sense. The next one is build build service as a business.
Yeah, and this seems so obvious, but in interviewing a lot of companies, there's generally several different business models for service. One is sort of, businesses run by supply chain,
Hmm.
as part of a supply organization, and the goals are often skewed towards parts management, logistics, and efficiencies on the back end of the business, and sometimes the front end of the business is less emphasized, and that could be older commoditized products and automobile chains, things like that. Then you have sometimes operations run service, and it's similar but more about production and ensuring the process is efficient and they run it. And then there's other business models where they look at service and say, well, yes, logistics will live and die in logistics and supply chain. Those are absolutely core principles, but we should look at the service delivery just like a business. We're selling a product. The product is the service. We're
Hmm.
providing something to the customer that has significant value. They're paying good money for it. We should look at the service as a product and the delivery of the product, and we should think in how do we improve the product over time? What technology, for example, should I adopt to improve delivery on the customer side? So just like if you're selling a product or in marketing and developing a product, we like to treat service in the business such as a product. And that
Hmm.
product has P&L responsibilities. And we like to look at service. And I think it's not just unique to Medtronic, but a lot of companies want service to be self-funding, meaning that you have enough revenue to come in to support the growth and the scalability and the operations that you have. So you're not pulling on different aspects of the business. And I think that's very important. It's hard to do.
Hmm.
It's very hard to do, especially in the early years where you're overemphasizing certain aspects of the business to ensure, you're going through the learning curve just like customers are at the same time. And that implies cost and probably more people than you need in the latter half of your
Hmm.
product life cycle. So it's important tracking that, getting good excuse me, finance partners, tracking the metrics and the KPIs consistently to make sure we're delivering the right product, and then focusing on the like any business. Every year, it's not about raising costs; it's about reducing costs. That's
Hmm.
true no matter what business you're in. So if you understand the business aspect of what you're delivering, then you could start focusing efforts on reducing waste and ensuring that the customer is still getting the best delivery,
Hmm.
but maybe at a lower cost to them and lower cost to ourselves too.
Hmm.
So that's a fundamental. It's not necessarily you have to do it that way, but I think in a business that is important to the overall corporation, it's important that we think about delivering profitability, restraining costs, and doing all the normal things that we would do to be successful. I
Yeah.
certainly, all the big companies do this very successfully.
Yeah. So I want to talk next about, determining the most effective structure. And I think as part of that, it's important to think about, how you build that good working relationship in a structure like you have where there is regional delivery with the sort of global overlay, right? So can you talk a little bit about, I know, like I said, companies have different structures in place, find different things work. But, for you at Medtronic, how did you determine that this was the best structure and how do you kind of nurture that working relationship?
It's a good question, and part of it is the time scale that we've had to focus on service. So in some organizations, service doesn't get involved until the product is close to launch, and then they kind of plug the product into their standard process and then go along with it. But given that the organization gave us 10 years lead time or a little bit less on the service side to think about service delivery, I think it became and obviously in working with our regional partners, it was really collaborative and understanding, all right, what are the gaps? You start with the standard gap analysis. If a region is managing an entire suite of products and not just a single robot, it changes the calculus. And some of the competition, they're a single product company for the most part, and they get to focus 100% of their efforts on one child, and that gets all the love, all the attention, and the entire business is built around that. But Medtronic, we have a lot of products, so we want to make sure that we understand. And again, I use the example of a ventilator and a robot. A ventilator, when they have 20 or 30 in the hospital, 24-hour uptime may not be as important. COVID is certainly an exception, but in a normal operating environment, they may not have to deliver that quickly. However, we talked about the robot. The entire business is around maintaining that high uptime satisfaction with the customer. So it changes things. We start thinking about stocking locations. Do we go with a central location that sometimes is more efficient, or do we disperse our parts closer to the customer site, which is what we're doing and what we typically do? So it comes down to what can the region deliver, what can we support, and then how does that evolve over time? Say we may launch in Europe or in the EU 3 years ago. So what we were doing 3 years ago is different than what we're doing today. As the organizations mature, the region picks up more activities, more tasks. They take on more responsibility. Whereas if we're going into a new region, brand new launch, my organization gets more involved down to the grassroots level, supporting installs, making sure the training is improving, making sure we're supporting the customers through some hypercare processes. So depending where the launch process is and the maturity of the product, you have to be able to customize your approach and scale so that the delivery at the point of the customer is never affected. In other words, you can't just assume that a new region has the same level of expertise and capability as a mature region that's been doing this for 3 years with 80% of the service teams trained and operating effectively. So it's part of it's a learning curve, but also it's really paying attention. And our regional partners are excellent. They're really collaborative, and we work closely together. And it's just like anything, every strat plan period, we always reevaluate the gaps. What are we doing well? What can we compensate? How can the region support us further, or vice versa? How can my organization support a region that may be starting off and starting to train their people? Can we supplement them? Can we provide them with extra parts, for example? Can we advise them on the best trade routes, logistics routes, to make sure their parts are arriving when they need a spare part before they need it in a crisis situation? So there's lots of examples of that, but basically you have to be flexible, and you can't assume that every site around the globe is the same. Some are operating at peak efficiency, others may struggle a little bit and may need some more support.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we talked a little bit already about the idea of productizing service, right? So when we talked about, building this out as a business, but I want to come back to this point because I think it's an area that companies can struggle with. I think there can be a lot of factors here that prevent organizations from really looking at this as specifically and strategically as they need to. And it can be because service is this intangible thing. It can be because the company has always been more product centric, and service has always been sort of the necessary evil, or something that they think about discounting or throwing in to make the product sale, et cetera, right? So when you think about some of the specifics, like of what it takes to productize service, to take that more strategic approach, what are the considerations? What's the advice you have on, really looking at that bit in that way?
Yeah, and that's an important question, because ultimately there's a finite budget for everything. Nobody gives you open-ended budgets and say just spend whatever you need to do whatever you need. And I think it comes down to understanding what part of the life cycle your product is. You go, we're in the, in some regions we're brand new, and others we're in that, getting more mature and kind of the learning curve. So I think it's important to understand in the very beginning of a launch, everything costs more. You're on the learning curve. You probably, you have more people involved than you need to, say, at the later stages. You're overcompensating to make sure the service delivery is on time and flawless. And as you go through that learning curve, you start to realize, okay, that this, what we thought was important 2 years ago is less important today. So we're going to shift or we learn something new. We've learned in this region, customers expect X, Y, and Z, and we have to adapt on the fly. So the other part of it is, and this is where exquisite planning comes into play, is understanding what is the sort of the pipeline of processes and projects and improvements I need over the next 5 years that will continue to, again, improve service, lower cost, provide a best-in-class experience. And you may have choices, and I use a very simple example. You may have $1 million and you could spend it on hiring excellent field service engineers, bulk up the parts forecast and make sure you've got forward stocking locations, or you could maybe update your SAP platform and not get all that other stuff, but you could probably manage through SAP with some manual minimal viable processes and maybe some manual pain points for the first year. So you have to make those trade-offs. And I would 100% of the time go into the 3 Ps: people, parts, and placements. If you kind of use an example of emphasizing that structure first before I kind of pivot towards systems and, best in class and making it easier to process parts and contracts and that sort of thing. So you have to have a very sober conversation with your finance teams and understanding the requirements of leadership and what you're expected to deliver. And once you have that roadmap, then it's negotiating and understanding, well, okay, if I have this funded, I can deliver X downstream, or if I have, more test fixtures in my depot, which sounds mundane and nobody in sales gets excited about that. But if I can add more test fixtures and do more product returns, I can get those parts back to rework or refurbishment, which can be back in the supply chain and reducing costs. So that's kind of where, some of it's boring for a lot of people, but we thrive on operational analytics and understanding. If I just had, this process, I could do more, or I can provide a better outcome. So it's nothing more than treating it like a business, and in many cases, an operations business. And this is where my operations experienced engineers are fabulous. They the depot operations, the ability to understand forecast planning, parts planning, safety stock, trade route compliance, all those are the unsung heroes. Because if you get, beans and bullets and supply chain up and running, that's a problem you never want to have. You never want to launch your product and go into back order, because that is no fun.
Yeah, those, making sure those foundational pieces are rock solid. That's a good point. The next success factor is putting proper emphasis on personnel and culture. So let's talk about that a bit.
Yeah, that often doesn't get talked about enough in service. We always assume that service is, the generic Maytag repair person, like we used to see in the old days in commercials. But, we always like to ask a sort of a fundamental question when we're hiring global service engineers in particular. And it kind of comes around to, if you see a burning fire, a house on fire, what's your first instinct? Are you running into the house to save people, put the fire out, or are you running to the phone to call the the fire department? And generally speaking, our people are first responders. Their gut instinct is to go in and solve the problem, the fire, to rescue the situation, versus stepping back and then calling in other people. And that's often an indicator when I interview people. The people who are charging into the problem are often the people who are the most successful at what they do, because the amount of work they do and the amount of off hours support, making sure that the customer gets feedback, or the startup specialists who are operating within the customer account get feedback there. So hiring the right people is important, because the other aspect of it, and I shared this analogy with you prior, and I share it with other people, as first responders, we're often the first into the deal. the robots we see sometimes have a technical issue. Customers are stressed out. Our internal partners sometimes get stressed out as well. It's natural, right? It's, I need it fixed overnight, and I need it operational. I need it safe and effective, ready for the next case. So it can wear on you. And so making sure you have that supportive culture, making sure you've got the right people, making sure they're recognized for the efforts goes a long way. And then, I say diversity too. It's really important that you just don't have the same cookie cutter type person. Diversity of experience, I think, is really important. Diversity of character, of gender. I think it's really important to get the right mix in there, because our customers are all not the same.
Right.
And how we deliver service often takes a unique approach, and getting a diverse level of opinions and experience will often help us solve problems quicker.
Yeah.
So culture is very important. It's important in Medtronic. Any company is probably, I'm not saying anything unique here, but we put a significant emphasis on ensuring that we have a strong culture and a supportive culture for our teams.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is really important. And, oftentimes service is, less recognized, than other aspects of the business, and making sure that, you do acknowledge and reward the crucial role that they play in the business is really important. Okay, so the next one is around standardizing systems and processes. And what I'm curious about here too a bit, Mark, is, you talked about the relationship between the regions and your global function. And you also talked about, the importance of understanding those regional differences and understanding where, customer expectations vary, where, needs are not consistent from region to region, et cetera. And those things are real. So I'm also curious, how you strike a balance between standardization, not only on systems and processes, but on, sort of the service experience or the brand experience versus, that autonomy to customize and tailor the approach in the ways that it matters region to region.
And that's very important. And again, it kind of echoes the start from the customer on back. And in many cases, we talked about the paying customer, the commercial hospital and all that, but we might have a distributor in a country as well, or a smaller team in a country that's not always on the main pathway of support. So I think it really is important to for example, if I'm going to deliver 24-hour mean time to repair or greater 95% uptime, you have to deliver that to every country. You can't make exceptions just because it's hard to get parts there, or just because the environment is hard to work in, humidity, heat, all these things come into play. So it's important to level the playing field so that our internal customers and then their patients and customers have the same level of support no matter where they are in the world, in the country. And there may be slight differences, just there are just nuances. For example, I mentioned India can't use refurbished parts, so we have to make sure that we've got the right parts in country, and we account for that, and we kind of enable that. Other countries, there are labor laws. There are legitimate and reasonable labor laws around work hours, and making sure we support customers. If the customers are working weekends, or if they expect to do surgical cases at 7 a.m. Monday morning, and we have an issue on the weekend, we have to support that. We can't just ignore the process. And so I think it's really, and then when I talk about standard approach, there's simple things like, how do we calculate uptime? Is there a consistent process globally, in our systems? And something as simple as that, sometimes you can find some nuances that would, if you don't correct them, can provide an inconsistent view of your customer base. And then you have to measure customer success. It's not just good enough to measure internal KPIs, but you have to do net promoter scores. You have to listen to what the customer is saying on the whole holistic aspect of what the company is doing, not just service, but there's an entire ecosystem of support there. We're one important part of it, but you have to survey the customer base and really gauge our our internal KPIs aligned with customer expectations. Because we might have one KPI that doesn't match anything what the customer expects, and you could have a completely missed opportunity there. So I think standard approach, one operating system like SAP, and sometimes you might find each region is a different instance of SAP, and that's where it gets expensive and hard to change. So how do we ensure that we have the right complaint system in place so that we're tracking complaints effectively? How do we ensure that we're tracking parts movement, parts flow? Again, some of this is boring unless you're in an operations world. Customer doesn't care about all that. They just want to make sure their system is running 24/7, 365. So
sure. But I mean, that's what it takes to do that, right?
yeah, that's exactly right. And the smoother the process behind the scenes, the more effective the delivery of service is out in the field.
Yeah. Yeah. So it seems like, there's more standardization than there is not. It's just a matter of more making accommodation. It's less, I think, I mean, maybe I'm just arguing terms in my mind, but like to me, when I hear the word customization, I think people start thinking like, exception or, that sort of thing. What I'm from what you're describing, it's more accommodation. It's more understanding like local requirements, local laws, local circumstances that, it's not about like, well, this rule doesn't apply to you. It's about like, this is the rule, the circumstances here are different, so therefore the process needs to be different as
Yeah.
well.
You have to be
Yeah.
adaptable,
Yeah.
and as you learn over time, over time, certain things should become more standardized. On the back end of the business, how we order parts, how parts move. But at the front end, is, as I mentioned, that's where you have to listen to what the customer is really asking
Yeah.
for,
Yeah.
and over time, their experience, between 0 and say the first 50 surgical cases is likely going to be different than a 400th case when their learning curve is different and their volume is increased. So you have to match the pace of your service delivery to where the customer is and where they expect to go. You
Yeah.
can't just fall off. You can't just ignore it. You can't just sit back and say, "Oh, we're good to go," because the service journey is always new. And every year it renews, and every year you're back on the clock of
Yeah.
delivering what they expect, what they paid for. And then part of that, again, is what the organization expects. If system is down, the customer isn't doing surgeries, and that affects everyone. So
Yeah.
I keep repeating the same themes here, as you see, but it's simple, but it's often hard to do if you don't
Right.
align, if you don't know what you're aiming for. If you don't have the right metrics and the right organization, then you can make some mistakes, and sometimes costly mistakes.
Yeah. I think too, what I'm thinking about as you're saying that is, what we're really talking about in the customization bit is sort of, at least from the customer standpoint, it's like in the last mile, right? It's because the back end visibility, systems, processes, alignment, infrastructure is consistent. But, there might be these, differences in approach that a customer requires that is, it's not complete true customization. You're not starting from scratch to say, okay, customer, we're going to do something completely unique for you. It's really leveraging that infrastructure and
Right.
then tailoring the last bit to what it is that is different about their need. And I think this gets into, I had a conversation about this sort of thing at a workshop I was at last year where we were talking about the idea of servitization or outcomes-based services. And it was, this idea that, yes, customers want personalization and customization, but offering that doesn't mean it's 100% customization and personalization. Otherwise, it would never be a scalable business model, right? You're talking
Exactly.
about creating the consistent approach that fits 80, 90, 95% of the product or the service, and then tailoring whatever bit it is that gives them the personalization or customization that they're looking for.
I was actually reviewing one of your old podcasts a couple weeks ago, and I saw it. I think it was Roy Dockery, if I remember,
Hmm.
who was one of the speakers, and he said something that caught my attention, and I noted it here to make sure I mention it, and it's kind of what you're talking about here. But he it's trying to remember the exact quote, but he said service by nature is reactive. The field teams are reacting to a problem. And I think his point was service leadership needs to be proactive and engaged. So on one hand, you're catching the ball, you're the catcher, and you're catching the problems. But on the other hand, you have to get out, engage with customers to ensure that we are delivering the right process, that we're not reacting on a leadership side, but we're proactively understanding, listening, and adjusting so that we anticipate what the customer is going to want before they actually need it.
Yeah.
So I think that was an important kind of point I wanted to mention, because it really is, service leadership needs to be out in the field, talking to our internal and external customers, observing the service being delivered firsthand, go into the DCs, seeing how the parts are flowing, and engaging with all the critical elements to support that final delivery element. And that's kind of, I think, what Roy was talking about. Is react is when there's a problem, but be proactive in understanding the nature of the problem and how to prevent it in the future.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a really good point. So let's talk a bit about that internal audience. So understanding your internal audience and also obviating the internal headwinds, which I think is a great headline.
Yeah. So I kind of touched upon this a couple of times, and the thing you learn pretty quickly is that our commercial teams are exceptionally passionate, especially the clinical support people who are in the operating room on a daily basis supporting the robot, and they're often they're observing stuff, right? So we get notifications what's going on. We get all the usual log files and machine data that help us understand the problem, but listening to the startup specialist who's describing the case and what happened and where arms were positioned is important. And then so on one hand, it's adding more information to solving the problem. On the other hand, we spent a lot of time at Medtronic, and not just my team, but the overall leadership group. Every week we do calls with each region, and we listen. They provide us with, here's what's going on with these customers. It's not just service. There's training challenges. There's contractual things going on. There's volume, deals, and then there's service. So we often collaborate. We communicate openly. We listen to what the teams are saying, and we provide data back to support them. So I think it's really important, and our leadership has done a really good job at removing barriers. If we're solving a customer problem, we get clear pathway to solving it. Nobody's going to stop my service team from going out overnight to solve a problem. So we've been blessed with that sort of leadership opportunity. But on the other side is, our regional partners have been very vocal about giving us input. This is what's working, this is what's not. Here's how we could solve certain problems. So they do it every day. So listening and understanding what they're going through, we have to incorporate into our strategy and our support mechanism. So I think and what I mean by headwinds, sometimes headwinds can be financial. Hey, I don't have the budget, but including your finance partners, like I mentioned earlier, so they see the problem unfolding, and they see, hey, maybe we need this piece of machinery, so it's not a surprise to them. They're included in the process, so that when we need to make a decision, 90% of the information is already included because they're partnering with us on weekly calls, for example, and planning and calls. So it's internal partners, absolutely critical to removing barriers and making sure we can go speed to peak in solving problems. And our internal customers are representing our customers, our clinical customers. So it sounds simple, but it's really important to set up those recurring meetings, letting the regional partners kind of develop the content and share back. And then on our side, we also have to make sure we are being continuous, or we provide a continuous flow of updates to our service partners about, software updates, if there's any field corrective actions, any changes to the product or technical bulletin. So it's a two-way street. If we forget something, they can make mistakes. So, and it's something you have to continuously work on. You can't just do it once a quarter. You got to find the right cadence of communications and align with the people. So it becomes one organization. It's not just global versus regional. It's basically an entire team of people who happen to be this mix of both organizations who are working towards, one common goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So number 9 is that idea of not losing sight of constant communication. And I'm curious,
Yeah.
you've talked about some of the ways that you keep that in place and how important it is. Is there anywhere you've found in your experience like the traps of where it falls short or where that losing sight bit, you can get caught up in this or that and then, not keep that going the way you need to?
Yeah, it you can get into this drift point where you're so comfortable with communicating stuff that you may forget, it was so obvious that I forgot to communicate, that we're changing a part number, down and making sure that that's downstream. So sometimes it's attention to detail, right? It's like anything we do, it's making sure that you do some gap analysis and you have an efficient order to cash process. So you're tracing the internal processes to make sure that, for example, a service contract, right? So we have a contract that somebody actually put it in the system. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, who's responsible for that? So communicating that, so there's different levels of communications. There's higher level, leadership level communications where we're talking trends, customer satisfaction, strategy. And then there's kind of the blue collar level of communications, which my team engages in every day, all hours of the day with various partners, from logistics, supply chain, regional service managers. And that's continuous. What's
Mm-hmm.
going on? How can we support? How do we close the loop? So it's every company goes through this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not telling you anything or sharing anything. Everyone's like, of course, constant communications, but you have to memorialize those communications
Mm-hmm.
too. You can't just talk about it in the hallway and assume that they're going to remember and go off and do this. So if there's a project, you have to charter it, you have to fund it, you have to get a project manager driving that process, in
Mm-hmm.
an extreme sense. If it's a simple, hey, heads up, we're about to see some parts issues or we have a supply chain issue. I'll give you a heads up call and I'll send you a memo later on with the details. It goes a long way, just letting
Mm-hmm.
people, not be surprised.
Right.
So managing up to leadership, making sure they're aware if there's any field issues in a KOL customer, or if they're going to a trade show, they might want to know, hey, do we have any opportunities or surprises in the field last week if a doctor meets me? So keeping them informed is important, but also there's a lot of ground level communications that have to be continuous,
Mm-hmm.
and keep notes, archive it so that new members of the team who join are not overwhelmed, have the archives available so they can reach speed of operations pretty
Mm-hmm.
quickly. Yeah, common sense stuff, but sometimes it's easy to cancel a meeting. It's
Mm-hmm.
easy to forget sending out that email. It's easy not to pick up the phone. And I tell my team a lot, a bit old school. Sometimes an email is okay for just reminding somebody, but if you really want to get stuff done, you got to pick up the phone or actually
Mm-hmm.
walk over to the person and actually have a verbal conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just a text that you hope they listen to or
Mm-hmm.
acknowledged and follow up on. And I think it's important in the business we're in that the communications happen fast. You can't let something age. Like if there's a customer issue, I can't sit for a week
Right.
before I tell leadership what's going on. And it's usually the same day because
Mm.
otherwise they'll hear about it from other people,
Right.
and then they're surprised. So
Yeah.
it just keep up the loop, keep the communications going, and this includes R&D. Making sure release product engineering has the latest trends, quality. I should raise my hand a dozen times and mention quality. We're on a quality system. We have a quality partner engaged with all the decisions we make to make sure we're following the rules and doing it
Mm-hmm.
right. So in operations, so there's certain key partners within my organization that we hug closely and include in our leadership meetings, and finance, quality are two, and operations are three of the most important areas in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. All right. Last but not least is have a thick skin, but stay positive and motivated.
And then this kind of goes to the cultural aspect too. As I mentioned, when you're always engaged with highly stressed situations, and not always highly, but sometimes they're fun. Installations are more fun because it's new, but you're dealing with problems, and I think sometimes our engineers, they're very sensitive. They own these problems. They feel it's kind of their empathy is off the charts. So it's important to understand, you know, like an emergency room doctor, you've got to be objective. You got to treat the patient. You got to do everything you can and do the best you can, but you can't let it get you down. In the global scale of things, our customers really appreciate the service engineers. The organization's been exceptionally supportive, and it really helps when leadership says that, when they share their feelings, when customers say thank you. It's kind of like we do work in the dark often. We're often, behind the scenes. We come in after hours and fix it. And, among us service professionals, we're always thanking our people and acknowledging. But it goes a long way when, you get an attagirl or an attaboy, or when the commercial teams, recognize the effort, and sometimes it's an effort trying to get a part somewhere. When you're back ordered, it takes, a village of people. And so I think it's important to hire the right people who understand the nature of the job. We're not delivering babies. We're fixing stuff. We're maintaining stuff. We're installing stuff. We're doing problem solving. And it's very rewarding, but it can wear on a person over time. So I think it's important to keep morale up, to do fun stuff, to go out in the field and engage with customers, because that's very, very rewarding. And then measuring your success with net promoter scores and surveys, and then providing that feedback to our teams to make sure they see the positive results. And by the way, we do get a lot of compliments from our customers, and that goes a long way. When they say thank you, or hey, we didn't even see the system downtime when you did that planned maintenance last week. And thanks for coming in on a Friday night and having it done by Saturday morning. So that's kind of an important part of building a team, and especially when you start going deep into launch period, there's inevitably going to be a problem, and how you keep your cool and how you communicate it goes a long way. And especially our commercial partners, telling them confidently, we're going to fix this problem tomorrow. We got this. We'll own the problem. We'll transfer the problem to our teams. We'll get the parts there. We'll fix it. We'll do the planned maintenance. We'll test, all the usual stuff. It goes a long way to reassuring that person who's got to go into the surgical case the next morning and tell the surgeon we're good to go. So that's just, it seems natural and intuitive, but it's really important to emphasize that in any service organization, you get very dedicated people and they care a lot. And sometimes you got to say, let's have a beer. It's okay. We're going to be fine here.
So I'm curious, as the leader of the team, how do you make sure you stay positive and motivated when you have a tough day or a tough experience?
Great question. Part of it's experience, and if I were, say, in my 20s, I'm certain I'd be more emotional than where I am today. With I've seen it, I've done it. I probably wrote a book on it, in past lives. So it's like any sort of leadership acumen. You've got to stay above it. You got to stay cool. You got to stay positive. You got to reinforce the positives and gently, correct people, or correct processes. So it's not easy. Sometimes I find myself going home and just, grabbing a beer and chatting with my wife and sharing hey, today was frustrating or not. But on the flip side, managing people is very rewarding. It's everyone has a story. Everyone is trying hard, and I find my days just listening sometimes to a challenge. An employee challenge. Sometimes I don't say much. I just nod my head, and they're like, "Thanks, that was great."
Yeah. Well, listening is a very important part of leadership, and one that unfortunately sometimes people, don't do as much as they need to.
And the other part, honestly, you got to have fun too. You buying lunches goes a long way. It seems very, well, duh, but and going down to the depot and sitting with the team and listening to what the technicians are doing and how their day is going. Or when one of my field managers, the hair's on, everything's going crazy in the field and they're about to go on PTO and they're stressed out, you call them up. Hey, put the phone down. You're fine. We got this. You don't need to check, messages while you're on PTO. And they do. And that's that's kind of the nature of the people we hire.
Yeah.
So you got to manage that, and it's all good if you're showing good leadership, if you're acknowledging mistakes. That goes a long way. Sometimes we make
Hmm.
decisions. You got to own up to it, and the other part is you got to protect the teams. When you do thousands of repairs, sometimes you make a mistake. Sometimes you clip a wire, or you
Hmm.
brick a power supply unit. The worst thing you could do is come down and
Yeah.
blah, 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 blah. The best thing you can do is say, let's get back on the horse. Let's try it again. No
Yeah.
worries. And you got to protect the teams to make sure that they don't overthink it or get depressed about it. So
Yeah.
again, like any sort of organization, if your teams are active and engaged and they feel like they have an open forum to share what's going on, it's healthy. It's absolutely
Hmm.
healthy. But if they're quiet, we used to say when I was in the army, if your troops are quiet, it's not good. Like when your
Hmm.
kids are quiet in the other room,
You
it's
know
not good.
something's
But if
going
they're
on. Yeah.
yeah, if they're complaining and loud and talking, then they're
Yeah.
engaged, and that's a good sign. So in
Yeah.
some regards, if your organization is sharing what's going on and engaged, that's excellent, and you try
Hmm.
to do everything you can to support what they're doing and make sure they have a good work-life balance.
Yeah. Great point. Really good stuff, Mark. Thank you so much for coming and sharing. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing the final results.
Absolutely. You can find more by visiting the home of Unscripted at futureoffieldservice.com. The podcast is published in partnership with IFS. You can learn more at ifs.com. As always, thank you for listening.